Morning, everyone, and welcome to today's discussion on Assembly Concurrent Resolution 188. My name is Isabella Nicosia, representing ISO Stakeholder Affairs, and I'll be facilitating the web conference today. I'm also joined on the line by Stacy Crowley, our Vice President of External Affairs here at the ISO, as well as David Hurlbut from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. And then we also have a few of the ISO team members as well as the NREL team members on the line today. We did post the draft summary report on the 13th, and then we posted the presentation that we will be discussing today. Both are available out on the Regional Solutions webpage on the ISO website, so you can get to that page by going to kiso.com. Then you'll want to go to the Stay Informed tab, and at the bottom of that tab, you'll see Regional Solutions, and you'll find all the related materials on that page. So before we get started, I have just a few housekeeping reminders to go through. First off, this call is being recorded, so the recording is for informational and convenience purposes only, and any related transcription should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. And if you need technical assistance during the call today at any time, please send a chat to the event producer. Our event producer is Michelle. We will be taking questions and comments throughout the call today, so when it is time for that, we ask that you raise your hand by pressing the raise hand feature in WebEx, which is located just above the chat window, or you can also submit your question in the chat to all panelists. And then just a reminder for everyone to please state your name and organization when asking your question so that everyone on the line knows who's speaking. And we'll remind everyone of these instructions when it's time for Q&A. So with that, I will turn it over to Stacy Crowley, and she'll welcome us and run us through the agenda.
Thank you, Isabella, and welcome everybody, and Happy New Year. It's the first time we've talked on Assembly Concurrent Resolution 188 in 2023. So Happy New Year to everyone, and thank you so much for joining the call today. So the agenda here is shown on the screen, just a quick overview of that. I'm just going to provide a reminder of what the resolution requests us to do, and then just a brief discussion about what we've done up to this point. Then I'll turn it over to David, who will walk through the general makeup of the report and introductions from he and his team. And then we will each together provide Q&A at the end. And then I'll just discuss timelines and next steps and just provide some important information at the end. So that's the general agenda. And so we'll turn it over. I'll just, thanks for flipping the slide, just remind folks what Assembly Concurrent Resolution 188 is. It was a resolution passed unanimously by both houses of the California legislature in fall of 2022. And it really was done to recognize that a lot of things have changed since they last asked us to look at the benefits of regional collaboration. That was with Senate Bill 350 back in 2015. So the resolution requests that we work in consultation with California balancing authorities to produce a report that summarizes really the relevant studies that have been conducted over the past several years regarding expanded collaboration and cooperation in the West. They would like us to identify the key issues that would most effectively advance the state's energy and environmental goals, and look at the impact of regionalization on transmission costs and reliability for California ratepayers, if those were identified in the studies. Also to look to see if there are any updates to the Senate Bill 100. There's a joint agency report that was conducted in 2021, and they wanted to see if there were any updates to that. Also asked us to recognize and discuss updates to recognize the conversation that's happening in the West, and that is how other states are looking at regional transmission organizations and the collaboration that has occurred between states on energy policies and regional transmission organizations in general. So they would like us to report and deliver that report by February 28th of this year, just a short time away. And we engaged with NREL, that you will hear from a little bit later, the National Renewable Energy Lab, to author the report and help us summarize the studies. We really wanted an independent view of this and make sure that we were just really doing what was asked in the resolution. So next slide, please. So the things that we've done up to this date, of course, the legislature passed the resolution in August of 2022. We then reached out to the California balancing authorities and formed a bit of a working group. And each balancing authority has at least one person engaged in this and have been participating in phone calls and the review of the documents. In September of last year, we also identified, as I said, the National Renewable Energy Lab as a third-party contractor to help us produce the report. In October, NREL did a lot of work making sure that we developed a list of studies, and we worked with them on that. We posted that list of studies. We had a stakeholder call to discuss both the nature of the report and the list of studies, and we asked for public feedback on the list to make sure we weren't missing any critical reports. And we did get some good comments back from that. Next slide. And then NREL did a lot of work in November, just really summarizing the studies, reading through all of them and capturing the main points, and then began drafting the report itself. The ISO and the balancing authority areas worked with NREL to review the draft, and we posted it on January 13th, as Isabella said. And we're holding this call today to walk through that report and then seek your feedback. Public comments will be due by February 3rd, and we'll discuss that later in the conversation today as well. So I wanted to just next talk about the partnership we've had with the California Balancing Authorities. You see the list here, and then the next slide is just a bit of a better description of where these balancing authorities sit within the state of California. So we could switch to the next slide. Thank you. They're all listed on the right, and we have engaged with them all. They all have been participating. So it's been great to have them as a sounding board and certainly provide good constructive thoughts and edits. All right, I am going to turn it over to David. David, take it away.
Okay. Thank you, Stacy, and thank you all for joining the call. We're very happy to be working with CAISO and with the BAs to put together this report. And there are three of us working on the team: myself, Brittany Spiedels, Mark Greenfogel, and we've been putting in a lot of time over a very short period of time to put together the draft that was posted. And I wanted to also acknowledge Scott Hasse. He was the person who sort of got NREL and CAISO together on this project in the first place. But it has been a very busy time, and I wanted to kind of start with a couple of things. First, as Stacy said, the intent of CAISO and the BAs, for bringing NREL in was to provide an objective, third-party view of the body of literature dealing with regional cooperation in the West, and we take that role very, very seriously. And I think up front, I do want to emphasize that whatever you see in the report, there is no endorsement by NREL of any mode of regional cooperation that is addressed in the report. Our role and our job is to summarize and describe what those modes are for the benefit of California and other states who may be engaging in discussions about such cooperation. We are not endorsing any position that the state of California might take in discussions in other Western states, even though this is, the focus of ACR 188 is how cooperation might benefit California. Any position would be determined by the state of California. We're not endorsing anything like that. And that would include assumptions about expanding CAISO itself. Understandably, that is a big topic of conversation in California. A lot of people are talking about that and thinking about that, and that's totally understandable. But there is no presumption on our part that this is the best option. It is one of many options, and we are teeing that up alongside other options that involve RTOs, other options that don't involve RTOs. As I said, our objective is to present an objective description of what the literature says about all the options. Next slide, please. All right, so in approaching this report, we did not want to come up with a study that would basically be, dumping a bucket of information on everyone's desk and say, here it is, go through it. The approach we decided to take was to summarize, provide a thumbnail summary of all of the relevant papers and studies and reports, and then have those as a separate section where there'd be a short description of each of them, but then follow that up with kind of an annotative summary. What is the narrative that comes out of this body of literature? What are the key issues that come out? What are the benefits? What are the types of benefits? How do they approach it? What are the other issues involved in kind of striking that balance between efficiency and state authority? So what you'll see as we go through this, and what you see in the report, is a very lengthy section, including thumbnail descriptions of every study, but then our attempt at synthesizing the narrative coming out of that, because I think that is going to be what will be most helpful, not only to the legislature, but to stakeholders who might be looking at various options. We want a couple of things that came out very, as kind of a high level message is that, cooperation does depend on mutual benefits for California and the rest of the West. Cooperation implies, sitting down with other counterparts across the table and looking at opportunities for mutual benefits. And the literature does suggest that regional cooperation will help California and other states realize cost savings and common energy policy goals. So there are benefits for everyone. But the literature also suggests that the benefits are not necessarily spread evenly across all states who might be participating, all utilities who might be participating. And this is natural. The grid is not homogeneous. There's no such thing as a gold-plated grid. There's going to be congestion. There's going to be line constraints. There are going to be different starting points that each utility and each state would have that will affect the degree of benefits that they would get from cooperation. And certainly some regional coordination has already taken place. It's taking place now, not only with institutions and such as the energy imbalance market, but even before that, over-the-counter trading platforms, ICE exchange. There have been a lot of coordination through these existing institutions for bilateral contracting. Our understanding of what the legislature was looking for was to understand additive or additional modes of cooperation that would not only increase the coordination but increase transparency with respect to pricing, and basically provide more a greater range of benefits to address the changes that are taking place on the grid. Let's go to the next slide, please. Now, the literature suggests that that there's some discrete modes of cooperation that one can envision in the West. Certainly, a single West-wide RTO But there are also studies that have looked at 2 Western RTOs, various configurations of a dual RTO West. And then there are also centrally dispatched day-ahead markets, centrally dispatched real-time markets for utilities that do not opt to join an RTO. And as many of you know, there's also been efforts to create a regional resource adequacy and reserve sharing program. And it should be noted that even with the RTO options, the RTO simulations, that doesn't necessarily require universal participation in an RTO or in one of 2 RTOs. It should be noted that particularly with the technical studies, one often has to make some assumptions to make the analysis tractable. And when you're looking at the upper benefit or the upper bound of likely benefits or possible benefits through, some configuration of an RTO, it is often necessary to make a simplifying assumption such as, universal participation, basically to make the analysis tractable. This is the approach taken in a lot of the studies that are included in this review, but it does not necessarily imply that there's going to be any requirement for universal participation, just as there is no such requirement now. Next slide, please. So in summary, we did find that the literature suggests very strongly that regional cooperation can help California achieve its goals for renewable energy, greenhouse gas reductions, and it can do so faster and with less cost to California customers. The RTO option tends to have the greatest benefits among the technical studies that were conducted. But it also increases the level of complexity of the issues that need to be addressed. For example, transmission expansion and who pays for additional transmission expansion. What are the criteria that go into determining how much is allocated to a particular region or particular state or a particular utility? And an expanded RTO can provide improved reliability and grid resilience, more flexibility, and fewer curtailments of wind and solar. But so can non-RTO options, but to a lesser extent because of the narrower scope of grid operations that are included. So we do see benefits across all modes of cooperation, but there are trade-offs. More benefits versus more complexity. Next slide, please. So, in order to kind of understand the narrative that emerged from the literature that we reviewed, we felt it was necessary to kind of provide some background. What is going on right now in the West and in the power sector that is making regionalization so important? Such a topic. We don't have to remind anyone in California about this. But climate change and it is creating a lot of stress on the grid from extreme weather events. And of course, that's happening everywhere. And that's a reality of operating the grid going forward that we're going to have to adapt to. There are also state policies for electrification in transportation, buildings, other sectors, and that's going to be increasing the amount of demand. California, as has every other state in the West, have made improvements with respect to the efficiency of electricity use, but alongside this improvement in efficiency is going to be this higher volume of demand from new sectors that that traditionally have not relied on electricity. We're also looking at transformation of the resource mix, not only in California, but in the rest of the West, and that is changing the dynamics of the exchange of electricity between regions. And then on top of all this are dwindling planning reserve margins, particularly in California and the Northwest, which is driving interest in looking at ways to sort of get ahead of these trends and address these potential shortfalls before they happen. Next slide, please. So, as I said, the rest of the West is changing in its resource mix as well. And this has implications not only for how the grid is operated, but also for the value propositions in regionalization. There have been a lot of coal retirements over the past 6 years. And the fact that these retirements have hit record levels, even during times when there has been political will in Washington to support coal and keep coal going, the fact that those retirements still occurred suggests that this is not necessarily a policy-driven thing as much as it is an economic transition, a fundamental transition in the power sector that is going to be part of the reality going forward. The West has seen growth in wind, solar, more use of its natural gas resources, and the beginnings of an increase in storage capacity, addition of storage. And this new mix favors new practices that weren't necessarily as valuable when the resource mix was dominated by coal. Energy markets increasingly value flexible resources. And a consequence of that is that fast energy markets, fast real-time markets, where dispatch and prices are determined every 5 minutes, 15 minutes, has value that was not necessarily the case when there was a lot of slow-moving baseload in the West. Economies of scale are different. It used to be that the greatest economies of scale were achieved by putting as many megawatts of capacity in a central station, a central coal plant or a central station natural gas plant. That's no longer the case. With wind and solar flexibility, the economies of scale are actually increased by geographic diversity. And this, this is a source of value, but it also changes how the resources are managed in the market. And as a consequence, baseload as a concept is less useful for operating the grid on a 24-hour basis than it was maybe 20 years ago. So all of these are sort of adding up to new requirements for how the grid is operated, and as a result, new value propositions, and regionalization has an impact on these value propositions. Next slide, please. So this has implications for how California, particularly CAISO, and the West exchange electricity. If you look at the source of power for load-serving entities, there's still going to be there has been historically a need to procure a lot of resources from the rest of the West. Given the increase in electrification and everything else that's happening in the West, that is unlikely to change. Some entities will need to export more surplus solar in the middle of the day to minimize curtailment, which requires more, better, faster access to a regional market where these surpluses can be placed in an expeditious and efficient manner. And then reserve sharing is something that would help California and the rest of the West manage the reserve margins that at this point are on a trajectory of growing smaller. Next slide, please. And then finally, an important point is, particularly when we're looking at the West as a whole, expanding CAISO is not the only game in town. Southwest Power Pool is an RTO that borders the eastern side of the WEC region, and there has been interest not only from SPP but from utilities in that part of WEC to explore options that would involve markets that would be operated by SPP. So particularly in this part of the West, states, utilities are comparing options, not only modes of regional cooperation, but similar products and similar programs that are offered by CAISO and SPP. So there are a lot of options on the table for states, particularly as you go farther from California in WEC. And this affects the array of benefits that each state and each utility and each BA would be looking at in evaluating, just how it might approach regionalization. Next slide, please. So there have been a number of efforts already underway to look at cooperation, and we provide summaries, and we worked very closely with CAISO staff in putting together some summaries. A number of states, through their PUCs, through their state energy offices, got funding from DOE to conduct something that we refer to as the state-led market study. This basically did a technical analysis of different types of regional cooperations and different regional configurations of those modes. It also included a survey of regulatory authorities, regulators throughout the West, to sort of gauge perceptions about different types of cooperation from the perspective of state regulators. There have also been individual state efforts looking at and promoting greater research and greater investigation in regionalization. Some of the most, specific directives have been in like Colorado and Nevada. Colorado, for example, has instructed, basically it's instructed its PUC that if there is an RTO option for Colorado by 2030, that the PUC will take steps to evaluate the options, and if the options are in the public interest, to basically make it happen. So a lot of interest in a number of states looking at the options, not just for RTOs, but also for other modes of regional cooperation, kind of a recognition at the policy level that this is a new value proposition. Next slide, please. So there are a number of frameworks for regional cooperation that emerge not only from the literature, but from activities that you all are involved in. Through CAISO, the Western Energy Imbalance Market, the Extended Day Ahead Market, which details of which have recently come out and are now under examination by stakeholders. But we also see parallel efforts through SPP that are focusing more on the eastern part of the WEC area. They have an energy imbalance service similar to the Western Energy Imbalance Market. And they're also developing something called Markets Plus, which is a day-ahead market framework, different in many respects from EDAM, but it's something, and not as far along in its detail as EDAM is, but it's something that a number of balancing authorities and load serving entities in the eastern part of the WEC area are looking at very closely. There's also the Western Resource Adequacy Program, and then a consortium of investor-owned utilities is looking at options for regionalization, kind of on their own initiative, the Western Markets Exploratory Group. Next slide, please. Okay, so when we looked at the body of literature that we had after soliciting comment from you all, from stakeholders about what should be included, what should not be included, everything fell into one of four categories: technical analyses that included production cost modeling, maybe capacity expansion modeling. And then there were several policy statements and analyses by government agencies. And we decided to put those in their own category because they're sort of a special species of analysis. There were also two legal analyses looking at the issues involved in regionalization, and then there were other relevant documents as well that didn't fall into any of these categories. One thing I do want to emphasize here, going back to the scope and the purpose of this report, our job was really to review the existing literature. And I know some of you had made comments that we should reinvestigate certain questions that for which existing analysis was outdated. While that is a valid concern, that was outside the scope. Particularly the technical studies, even the ones that were outdated, they took months to complete. We had weeks to complete this survey. So it was not in our scope, and we didn't have the time to generate new analysis to supplement what was missing. One consequence of that is that even though there might have been key questions coming out of the narrative of the review that might have gaps, because if there were no studies addressing those issues, there was really very little to say about it, except that there was a gap in the literature. So we were able to take some of the older studies and look at things that had changed since then. For example, changes in the capital cost of wind power, solar power, the increase in storage. But that's really sort of adding new information to the old analysis. We did not re-examine the issues that those studies did. So that was a necessary limitation based on the scope of what ACR 188 looked for. Next slide, please. So I want to go over the narrative that emerged from this body of literature that we reviewed. And as I said, we put this in a separate section. Everything in this discussion has annotations to studies in the previous section. So there's sort of a specific, easy way to track statements in the summary to its source documents. But what emerged, most of the studies, most of the technical studies, and a lot of the reports focused on three types of benefits: reduced production costs, reduced resource adequacy costs, and efficient transmission planning. And sort of wrapped up in all three of these were benefits of maintaining reliability at a lower cost of procuring operating reserves, a lower cost of resource adequacy, more efficient use of transmission investments. Next slide, please. So, as I mentioned in the executive summary, and we go into more detail in this section, certainly a more comprehensive structure for cooperation, such as an RTO. It enables the optimization of a wider array of grid functions, and this broader optimization can yield greater cost and decarbonization benefits than more limited forms of cooperation. But these larger and more comprehensive structures increase the number of issues that have to be addressed in protocols, in operating rules, in business practices, and that adds to the complexity, and it adds to what BAs, what participating utilities, transmission owners all have to decide on a joint basis. Next slide, please. Non-RTO forms of cooperation, those that focus on sort of specific types of grid functions, such as a day-ahead energy market or real-time redispatch. Those more limited forms also yield benefits, even though they might not be as large as the full panoply of operational benefits that you get with an RTO. But as I said, the trade-off is that you might have fewer benefits, but you also have less complexity. So that is a trade-off that states, that BAs, and that utilities and load-serving entities will have to weigh as they discuss various options and approaches. Resource adequacy costs can decrease overall when there's coordination through programs such as the Western Resource Adequacy Program. This does, by expanding the pool of resources for reserves and for flexibility, it leads to a more efficient use of that entire pool, that entire resource pool, which can reduce the cost of resource adequacy with what the literature suggests would be a fairly low impact on state authority over things like integrated resource plans and other approaches to resource adequacy. Next slide, please. Now, we also looked specifically at what the literature said about the distribution of benefits, because when you move from theory to practice with respect to cooperation, you're going to have different parties coming to the table with different interests. So the distribution of benefits is going to be very important, and an important dynamic in formulating a strategy for moving forward with regional cooperation. The state-led study suggests that even though the overall benefits would be greater for a single West-wide RTO than for two RTOs, the distribution of those savings can vary across individual states. And this is fairly understandable for two reasons. Number one, the transmission grid was not built for the purpose of homogenizing everything across the whole West. So transmission congestion is going to affect the formation of LMPs, for example. But also each state and each utility sort of is starting from a different point with respect to existing resources that are retiring, resources that are transitioning. So these two dynamics mean that the distribution of savings among states and utilities can vary quite a bit. Next slide, please. And then finally, we also wanted to sort of focus in on kind of what this entire narrative means with respect to California's energy and environmental policies, because that was, one of the drivers behind ACR 188, one of the major things that the legislature wanted to understand. And, there were actually very few studies that focused just on the California benefits. It was really more an exercise of kind of looking at what what the studies might have said with respect to all benefits, and then kind of seeing um, what dynamics they included in their analysis that would provide some information for California specifically. But reduced operating costs, reduced capital costs, reduced resource adequacy cost. Those are benefits that that all states would see, including California. Improved resource adequacy planning, more use and more economic use of clean energy resources, and lower WEC-wide emissions. But as I said, because no study specifically focused on California exclusively, we had to sort of infer what the benefits would be from these other studies. This was particularly the case with studies that addressed regional transmission planning and cost allocation. Cost allocation was not really addressed or in a way that allowed some quantification of what those costs might be. But I think, as everyone knows, cost allocation is a huge issue in regional transmission planning, and as we're finding in interregional transmission planning as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so with this, I think I'll turn it back over to Stacy. Kaiso focused on the question regarding SB 100, so I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, David. Yeah, so section 5 of the report is fairly brief, but it's in regards to the request that the legislature had to provide any updates, if there were any, on the joint agency report that was completed in 2021. Just to get to the bottom line, there are no updates to that report. They have a requirement to provide an update every 4 years, and so we won't see any updates till to 2024. But we do provide just some basic information about what the SB 100 Joint Agency Report covers, and they really are looking how to most effectively meet the goals that SB 100 set forward, which is really to get to clean energy by 2045. So the report looks at 3 different scenarios, and then sort of provides some general information about what could be needed. It's really meant to be just sort of an outline to continue to look at the details of procurement and things to get to those goals. So in regards to the request in ACR 188, there's no new information, but we do try to provide just the basic information that was provided regarding demand forecasts and potential needs for transmission, and really what is significant need for new capacity to get to their goals. So with that, let's see, the next slide is back to Enra, back to David.
Yeah, and just want to wrap up with a couple of kind of overall comments to provide some insights into how we're approaching this task. The first is what I mentioned at the very beginning. We are not coming into this exercise with an idea that we're going to recommend one mode of cooperation over another, or one geographic configuration over another. That is not our job. That is going to emerge from deliberations among stakeholders. Our job is to provide a common knowledge base for that to occur. One thing that has occurred, that has come up numerous times in comments from stakeholders, in discussions about this report, is the emphasis on California, and I feel it would be really important to sort of be clear about our approach on that. We are not focusing exclusively on California with respect to what we are pulling out of the body of literature that we have reviewed. And so we are looking at impacts on other Western states, the rest of the West. And in my view, I think we have to do that, because even if you look at it from the standpoint of California, California needs to form a strategy that that uh, has realistic expectations of what is happening in the rest of the West, because they're on the other side of the table, and you know they bring particular interests, particular strengths, particular resources, and this is going to affect strategically what the shape of regional cooperation is going to look like. So in our view, it is important to understand what the matrix of benefits are for the rest of the West. We understand that that some stakeholders might prefer a harder focus on California. We understand that. Um, our our view on this is otherwise. We believe that this is consistent with what the legislature is looking for in AC 188, not just you know enumerating how California might benefit, but kind of a broader knowledge base that would help inform a strategy for approaching energy environmental goals for the state. Um, so, um, I do want to make clear that that is the approach we're taking. We feel very confident that that is the way to go, and that it is consistent with ACR 188. Um, and so, with that, I think we can go to the next slide and open it up for questions and comments.
Yes, operator, can you instruct folks how to raise their hand and ask questions?
Absolutely. So ladies and gentlemen, as we approach Q&A, if you would like to ask a question via WebEx audio, please press the raise hand icon on your WebEx screen. It's located above the chat box to the right. That will place you in the question queue. If you are joined to today's meeting via regular audio, you will need to press #2 on your telephone keypad to enter the question queue.
And while we're looking for hands raised, David, there is a question in the chat about, and this is probably sort of general or common to studies and assumptions and things, but there's some confusion about definitions such as operating costs versus production costs, resource adequacy versus capacity, and the question is about how we can try to standardize those things. But I don't know if you have a simple answer to that, but my thought is that every study is looked at in a different way. But if you have any thoughts there.
That's a great question. And so let me take a couple of minutes to talk about that in particular. Um, you know, as Stacy and I mentioned at the very beginning, a lot has happened in producing the draft that you have in front of you right now, and it happened over a very short period of time. Um, and in many, or in some cases, there might not have been as an adequate explanation of things like this, simply because um, of the frenzy that was involved in getting this draft together. And that's one of the reasons we really want to get your feedback on things like this. And I can say this is something that I want to clarify better. The use of production costs and how production costs are different from total cost. Um, uh, a number of the studies use adjusted production costs in looking at benefits, for particular states, where you look at not only changes in LMPs, but also the value of changes in exports and imports. So I do definitely take that point, and we will be providing clear explanation of those terms. It's going to be hard to standardize them because um, in some cases there might be really good reasons for changing the approach in a particular way. Um, but um, but I we will be providing additional clarity on those terms.
Thank you.
We do have a question in queue on the audio line.
Sure, go ahead.
All right. Caller, your line is unmuted. You may go ahead.
Thank you. So I was wondering, you mentioned the distribution of benefits that won't be spread evenly across all states and utilities. Oh, by the way, I'm Natalie Seitzman from Southern California Public Power Authority. Thank you so much for the presentation, the work you did to put this report together. And I was wondering if we could break down a little bit further, like what types of modeling or assumptions would be required to disaggregate those benefits below the state level, if possible?
Yeah, so the state-led study did make an attempt to do kind of a statewide disaggregation. It did not report out all of its disaggregated results, so there is some limit to what we could extract from that report. But for example, production cost modeling. You can sort of isolate collections of nodes to come up with regional LMPs for that selected configuration, and then add to that changes in total production, changes in inputs, imports, outputs. Imports, exports, and come up with an estimate of how the value of energy flows might change. But that's only one particular type of benefit. You add to that the impact and the potential benefit of transmission expansion. All right. Individual transmission projects as they're built right now, are mostly built by utilities, and their costs are allocated to their particular customers. In a more regional setting, like an RTO, there are different approaches to spreading those costs out throughout the entire region. It doesn't necessarily have to be a postage stamp approach, but figuring out what that mechanism is something that would arise once you bring transmission into that realm of potential benefits. So that's kind of a long answer. Doesn't completely get to your question, but there are an array of benefits, and many of them can be simulated and quantified, but it's an additional step to the analysis. And there wasn't much in the literature that did it, so we were also limited by that. As I said, the state-led study probably did the best job of anything that was included in the body of literature, so it's probably the best source currently available. But even then, there were limitations with respect to the underlying information that was not included. The underlying disaggregated information that was not included in the study.
Thank you. Operator, can we go? Is there another caller?
There are currently no additional questions in queue.
Okay, thanks. There is another.
One just popped in. I'm sorry, one just popped in.
Okay, and if you could state your name and affiliation. Thank you.
Caller, your line is unmuted. You may go ahead.
Thanks very much. This is Grace Anderson with the California Energy Commission. I just want to emphasize that I've reviewed this document and it's just a gold mine of really current and relevant information. And I'm very excited that NREL is engaged in this and the way that the ISO is approaching it from California as one of the 11 Western states and 2 Canadian provinces, rather than, somehow we are separate, because we're not. This is an important dance that we're all on the floor. It's not a question, it's just wanting to highlight for the 180 participants that on December 2nd, the Vice Chairman of the Energy Commission, Sivagunda, hosted a workshop on Western integration. And I'm not going to go into that, but there is a master slide deck posted on the IEPR webpage of the California Energy Commission website. And it is also a gold mine of current information about a whole range of subjects. We had really the state-of-the-art presenters that day. So if anyone needs to follow up on that, I'd be happy to work with Stacy. Thank you very much for this useful hour today.
Thank you,
Excellent.
Grace. And our wonderful project manager, Ken Swain, posted the link in the chat box too. So thank you so much.
All right, I do not see any additional questions in the audio queue.
Okay, well, I'll go to the next couple slides and then we can always come back and see if there are additional questions. If you can go to the next slide, please. So this is just a kind of overview of where we have been going and where we need to get to. And so this just discusses the work we've done since the resolution was passed in August. And we're now in January. We have the public stakeholder call. We are asking for stakeholder feedback by February 3rd. That's important for us to be able to read all the feedback and then make any refinements before we need to deliver it before the end of February. Our goal is to deliver it before February 28th, but that will depend on just how many comments we get back and how we can best refine that report. So we are still working on it. We do look forward to stakeholder comments on that. There is a template provided on the Regional Solutions webpage that Isabella mentioned earlier. And that template is just meant to help us categorize your comments basically by chapter. So it's easy for us to sort of take those and look at them chapter by chapter. And then here on the next page here, this is the link to the Regional Solutions webpage and some more information about when comments are due. And if you do have any questions along the way, there is a direct email box, info.acr188@caiso.com, where you can ask any specific questions. So maybe I'll just open up to see if there are any additional questions from the callers today.
We do have a couple questions in the chat. One from Grid Strategies. Why are production costs superior in the case of an RTO? Does it have to do with the assumptions about congestion management, transmission planning, or another aspect?
Yes, it's so one of the differences between how modeling handles an RTO and how modeling would handle kind of separate BAs covering kind of the same geography is that there are assumptions about additional cost in flowing power across the seams of the neighboring BAs. In an RTO, you have internal congestion costs, but those additional economic hurdles aren't there. The RTO paradigm kind of efficiently resolves all of the congestion within the geography. So So that kind of that creates some kind of lumpiness in the changes in how the LMPs might change geographically. But it does mostly come back to efficient dispatch across the entire geography and the reduction of those additional costs going between separate VAs.
There's another question here from Sean Neal. Did the literature speak to what California and other states should account for in terms of interaction with the federal government in exploring regional collaboration, whether it be FERC, DOE, DHS, or EPA?
The two legal analyses that we included in the analysis do speak to this. And in particular, they looked at, how, what differences there might be with respect to state authority and how that might change, with participation in an RTO. For California, that really wouldn't change a whole lot because CAISO already is an RTO. And a lot of the impact of sort of federal jurisdiction over wholesale power operations has to do with the fact that it is interstate commerce. So to some extent, that authority is already there. But the legal analyses that we looked at mostly came to the conclusion that things wouldn't change a whole lot with respect to interactions between the states and the federal government, at least with respect to the authority that's involved, because that the allocation of that authority between states and the federal government is primarily influenced already by the Interstate Commerce Clause.
Great. And that's the last question I see in the chat. Maybe just one more call for questions on the phone.
I do not see any additional hands raised on the phone at this time.
Well, thank you so much for listening in. Really glad to see so many folks interested in this conversation. And as we said, we do look forward to your comments that come back by February 3rd, and look forward to producing a good report at the end of February. So thanks so much, David, and your team and the other California balancing authorities for their engagement. And thanks for all of you who are interested in this topic. With that, we'll say goodbye and have a good rest of your day and weekend. Take care.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.